For those of you who aren't familiar with our program and the work that we're doing, this conversation is part of a larger public radio program that we released in the last month called The Rise of Islamist Parties in the New Middle East. And that's part of our radio show, Public Radio Show America Abroad, that airs on NPR, public radio stations around the country, like WAMU here in Washington. So we did 1 hour specifically on this subject. I think the CDs are outside for you. We also partner with a lot of leading television and radio channels in the Middle East and South Asia. We have an office in Tunisia, we have an office in Afghanistan, and we produce a range of programming that airs in those countries. In fact, just today, probably just a few hours ago, I think in Tunisia on one of their leading radio stations, Shems FM, we organized a town hall connecting Tunisians from the interior and the coast to discuss issues of political participation in Tunisia. That was Tunisians talking to one another. There were no American component to that discussion. That's an example of the kind of programming that we do, but you can get a lot more information about us on our website. This conversation is actually part of a series we call Beyond the Broadcast, and we do about 6 of them every year. And it's a way of building on the 1 hour public radio shows that we're doing here in the U.S. and trying to enhance the conversation here in Washington and get a little more deeply into some of the themes that are raised in the program. And what we'll do is just I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. We'll talk for a few minutes amongst ourselves and then open it up for questions from all of you. And so look forward to a good conversation. I won't belabor the long bios of our guests, but Nathan Brown, who was just telling me actually he's been a professor at George Washington University since 1987, so we're almost 25th year anniversary, I guess. Professor of Political Science, International Affairs, and Middle East specialty, and has many different publications, but I will just plug his most recent book, which I'm about to ask him about. It's called When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics, and that just came out at Cornell University Press. Jocelyne Cesari, who has a number of different hats, I guess now a senior research fellow here at the Berkley Center, at Harvard at the Center for Middle East Studies, where you're directing, I forget which project it is, Islam in the West, and then you also have an appointment at NDU here in DC. So you're on planes going back and forth regularly, and it's great to have you. We appreciate you spending the time here. I know you have to be back in Cambridge later this afternoon. And you have a new book coming out. I want to make sure to plug that as well. And the title I have here is Islam Betrayed, ? The Making of Modern Islam in World Politics. Correct? So extra reading for everyone to do after this conversation. We'll have a separate book signing. We can do that on a different event. So I'll just kick off, Professor Brown, and ask you about the book, which is the first thing that struck me and may strike others is the title, Victory is Not an Option. So what do you mean by that? And give us the main argument in a nutshell.
Sure. It's a...
Maybe two mics.
The book focuses on Islamist movements in 4 countries, the Egyptian, Palestinian, Kuwaiti, and Jordanian. And in all 4 countries, you've got strong Islamist movements kind of based on the model of the Muslim Brotherhood, the original Egyptian movement, that have very broad agendas. But over the past couple decades or so, they've found the political arena a very promising avenue. So the movements in these 4 countries have found the political arena much more attractive place in order to pursue their agenda. So the book really ask what happens when they get involved in politics. The title, When Victory is Not an Option, may be one that, at least in the Egyptian case, is of more historical than current interest, because essentially in all 4 countries they didn't have a realistic possibility of governing. So they're facing in a sense, the questions of how much to commit to politics, how much to kind of mold their ideology to appeal to the entire public rather than to their own little constituency, how much to sort of reconfigure themselves as political parties, and how much to just concentrate instead on social work. And they faced that question in an environment in which they weren't going to be allowed to govern. And even closer, okay.
The four countries again?
The 4 countries were the Egyptian, the Palestinian, the Jordanian, and the Kuwaiti.
Okay.
And essentially what I argue is that in all 4 cases, they do make significant changes. Movements are very different as a result of this experience. But they stop short of full fully molding their ideologies to a democratic system. Now, the real question is, in Egypt and in Tunisia, where you have Nahda, similar movement, when victory actually becomes an option, as it is right now, how quickly do they adjust themselves to sort of operating in a fully electoral and at least the possibility of a full democratic environment?
Well, I'd love want to get back to that and ask a couple more questions, but first, Jocelyne, I want to give you a chance. Your book's coming out, not out yet, so you can give us a little sneak preview on the main argument there. I don't know to what extent there's similarities or any overlap in some of the issues that you cover.
So the whole argument of the book is to look at state-Islam relation as a major element of the politicization of Islam everywhere. Usually we look at Islamists as opponents to the state, and we take for granted that the state have been secular and nationalistic in their, I would say, ideological orientation, which is partially true, but which should also mask a very important point, which is actually that Islam has been part of the nation building of most of these countries since the beginning. So I've done an overview of countries, even the most secular ones: Tunisia, Pakistan, Egypt, I forget one now, Iraq, because Iraq under Saddam was also considered a pretty secular state. And what I find in looking at the way that the state has institutionalized Islam since the last 50 years is actually that the political Islam that the Islamists are also referring to is actually the outcome of this nationalization project. It's not tapping into the Islamic tradition that has not been used over the last century. It is really working and operating within the framework of the state. So what does it mean? It means that the state did what no empire, Muslim empire, did before. They nationalized all Islamic institutions. They put the clerics on the payroll. They put Islam in the education system. And we have looked, because this was a teamwork, at all the textbooks that are used in public school, even in the secular one. And what do they teach about Islam? And it's a political message. Islam is related to ummah, to jihad, to citizenship, so no wonder why few generations after, the only way to oppose the state will be to use this framework. So it's clear we have covered most of the countries, and I don't want to extend more, but there is a lot here to look into that we have not looked into. Islam in the legal system, I mean, unlike what we think, Islam has remained at different degrees according to the country part of the legal system, especially for family laws. It has changed, it has evolved, but it's there, and it's very difficult, even in a country like Tunisia, to completely remove Islamic references for social, personal, and also political life. So I think there is. And what does this mean? It means that Islam and political Islam will remain a major political force. And if you look at four major, I'm going to stop here, four major points that I have also systematically covered in this project is to be a political force in all its efficiency, you have to have a certain degree of formal institution. One, you need a certain ideological coherence. Two, you need legitimacy and credibility. Three, and you need potential for social mobilization. If you look today at who is scoring on all these 4 points across the Muslim world, it's all Islamist party. I don't know, maybe to delve more into detail. And again, this didn't start in the 70s and 80s. It started right there as the nation building of the state. Because we tend to forget that Islamism is not, I would say, emerging after the failure of the secular nationalist project. It was right there at the beginning of the movement of independence, and the secular leader at one point or another, had to deal with it and to include Islam in the building of the new institution. So in a snapshot, it's not traditional, it's modern, and it's part of the nationalization and I would say modernization of politics in most of these countries.
So the kind of, I guess my question, the form or kind of Islam that the state was then promoting or propagating was something, if I understood you correctly, saying is now being used against it by Islamist parties.
Yeah.
Was it a liberal, pardon, this is a bit crude maybe, but was it a liberal form of Islam that the state was promoting, or how would you characterize it?
I know this is the hardest thing to understand from a Western point of mind. Because if I ask you right now, what is religion for you? I bet a lot of money that the response I'm going to get is a set of ideas and beliefs that are, that define me. If you look at the way Islam has been forged and built over the last 50 years by the state, it is not only a set of belief and faith or spirituality. It became a strong element of the national identity. So it was encroached on state institutions in a way that is very difficult to understand because we have in mind the Western history where modernization went with a dissociation between religion and state. In most of Muslim majority countries, modernization went hand in hand with conflation between state and Islam. The only two countries that did not make Islam religion of the state are Senegal and Indonesia. Everywhere, even Turkey, that is considered the success in Islam is religion of the state. It does have implications. So what I'm saying, it's not promoting a certain theological interpretation, even if you can look and see the clerics, they belong to a certain kind of school and they issue fatwas on a certain type, using a certain type of logic. But what has happened in the last 50 years is that this established dominant state institution have used religion or have been asked to use religion to promote political projects. Muftis issue fatwas on things that have nothing to do with religion as such, but with, nuclear weapons or position vis-à-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not religion. And this has been going on under Mubarak, under Saddam, under all kinds of so-called secular leaders.
So that means you're saying the form of Islam that, say, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt right now would be promoting will not be different from the kind of Islam that the state under Mubarak was?
If we look at institutions, because that's the main point here, it's important to look at ideas and discourse. What I did in this work is to look at institutions, because this is also what frames the experience of people. Article 2 of the Egyptian constitution that is now, in discussion to create a new set of institutions, but Article 2 established Sharia as the source of legislation. This is not an Islamist. This is not what what the Muslim Brothers have asked. It's already there. Islam is taught in public schools. You have Copts also in the education system. They are not provided the same resources to teach their kids in their religion as the Muslims. So this is already there. It's not that the Muslims are going to, or Islamists, are going to become more intolerant. The intolerance, so the principle of toleration in terms of law, was not there already in the nation-building system. That's so. If they come in, they're not going to create new institutions. They may just, use the framework which is already there.
Professor Brown, if you have any comments on anything that Jocelyne just said, otherwise I have another question just about your about when you were.
Well, let me just follow up very briefly.
Sure.
I mean, I would obviously I have not read her book, so I cannot comment on it. But because I'm in Washington, I can give a quick opinion nonetheless. It sounds to me, from what we've heard, that I think it fits how it is that the Brotherhood itself would see the Egyptian situation very, very closely. When outsiders tend to look at these places, they tend to focus on what I call the what questions. Okay, what role for religion in public life? In a sense, I think she's right. That has been decided. It's religious mandatory education, personal status law based on religion, religious state support for religious institutions at all levels, religious symbols in public life. The really important political questions are what I call not the what questions, but the who questions. Who is it that has the authority to speak for Islam in these various guises? And that's essentially where I think the Brotherhood is focusing its attention. As the political system opens up, as the electoral process opens up, all of a sudden there are possibilities for them to do this through the democratic system, through democratic processes and through the parliament, rather than through sort of creating some sort of, recreating some kind of caliphate or any institution like that. The existing institutions of the Egyptian state, democratized, are ones that will serve its agenda.
Just one other question on something you had said initially, and then we're going to just play one quick clip from our program and get your comments. You said, I think, that the Islamist movements or parties that you looked at in the 4 countries sort of stopped short of molding themselves into the democratic system or molding into a democratic ideology, if I may not have the wording exactly right. That was because they saw that victory wasn't an option. Was that the reason, or are there different reasons? In other words, if victory is an option in some countries, then that might change there.
Absolutely. I think it was because not simply that victory was not an option, but also because to the extent that, in a sense, a lot of the outside questions was, how democratic are these Islamist movements? And perhaps if they can show their democratic credentials, they could be allowed into the political process. In a lot of countries, the more democratic they got, the more they got oriented towards the political process, towards running in elections and so on, the more threatening they got, especially to the regimes, but also to non-Islamist political actors. So in a sense, they were given very strong disincentives and a very strong message: don't go too far. Now, it is going to be a very different situation in Egypt and Tunisia. I think that what we're going to see with Islamist movements in both countries and in any other country where you have a democratic opening is essentially the kind of process that ideological movements of similar kinds, not necessarily religious kinds. I think, in a sense, the socialist movement went through this in the first half of the 20th century in Europe. Early history of Christian democracy can kind of be, Christian democratic movements can kind of be written the same way. It's trying to figure out how much to emphasize politics and how much to devote to politics and political activity, how much to conceive of your movement as primarily a political party and how much in other ways. This is going to really press on the movement, and the leaders are ones right now who are used to operating in a very different environment. So the question is, how quickly can they make that switch?
We're just going to play one clip just to get your comments on something. This is a clip that we had a roundtable discussion. Again, it's a 1-hour radio show. We're proud that at least we can do one topic over an hour, but it's not a scholarly work. We can't claim it to be such. But we hope we're advancing, the public conversation, public discourse, and so on. We had a roundtable with Shadi Hamid from the Brookings Institution Doha Center and Rob Satloff at the Washington Institute, sort of discussing some of these issues in U.S. engagement and so on. And there was just one little exchange here on Islam that I just wanted to play and get your comments.
Well, it's not a surprise at all. Arabs generally are quite religious. They want to see Islam playing a larger role in their societies. All the polling we have makes that very clear. I think some Western analysts were maybe projecting a little bit and hoping that this would be some kind of secular revolution. And that was understandable. I mean, the most visible faces in the Egyptian revolution were young, tech-savvy liberals. But I think we just have to accept that more democracy means religion is going to play a larger role in public life. So I think here there was almost this desire on the part of Western analysts to kind of say, well, Egyptians are going to become fluffy secular liberals once they have freedom. And I think that's just simply not true.
Robert Satloff?
Well, I take a somewhat different view. First of all, I think it's a mistake to say that these are parties with Islam at their core. These are parties that have Islamism at their core. The distinction is how one translates belief into political action. Now, it is absolutely true that we underestimated the extent to which the Egyptian voters supported parties that advocated a certain view of Islam in public life. I think most analysts got the Muslim Brotherhood share of the vote right, but we totally missed the idea that an even more extreme form of Islamism, called Salafism, could grab the attention of a quarter of the Egyptian electorate, which is more than all the non-Islamists got put together.
There's a few things that we could discuss just based on that exchange, but the one that I wanted to focus on first was the distinction that Rob made between parties with Islam at their core, religious parties with Islam at their core, and religious parties that are Islamist. And Shadi then went on to take issue with that distinction, and I wanted to, if I could just get your understanding of that. Do you agree that there is a distinction? Are the parties that we're talking about in Egypt and Tunisia and so on Islamist rather than parties that have Islam at their core? Is there a distinction here to be made?
I mean, if we again define Islam as a set of belief and faith, the parties that are operating now are not pursuing this very, I would say, individualized kind of religiosity. They are looking or aspiring to a social project, to a total project. So again, to distinguish here, and it was said by the speaker, the belief into action is a very, very Western approach to religion. In the sense that some people may not even, believe or observe all the precepts of certain tradition, and they may still be convinced that the only way to change their society or the only political credible actors may be the Islamist. I mean, we tended to underestimate that they are perceived in all the societies as the pure, the honest. And that's why getting into politics in a professional way may alter this image. Because for 50 years, they've been the oppressed one. They've been the one who would say we have to fight against corruption and social justice. So you may not be, pious Muslim, but if you are a young man or young woman, this kind of project is appealing to you. And it means that they have a broad, I would say, popularity and credibility because, again, they have not benefited from the system that was put in place over the last 50 years. They have been continually oppressed. It's true in Tunisia, it's true in Egypt, and that's why they gain so much, credibility.
Well, if what your purpose is to make people curious about the radio program, you succeeded in my case, because I want to hear the rest of the discussion to see kind of where it was going.
It's on the website.
Okay, all right. But I listened to the beginning of it, but I didn't get a chance to finish it and hear the end of that discussion. I mean, I guess I would agree. I would push things a little bit or frame things actually as the movements themselves define themselves, which is a little bit interesting. And that is, they consistently call themselves civil parties with a religious reference. Now, that's a formula that was, in a sense, partly thrust upon them, because, at least in the Egyptian case, religious parties are banned. So they have to call themselves civil parties. But what they mean by that is they're not led by clerics, they're not led by religious authorities. The general guide of the Muslim Brotherhood is a professor of veterinary medicine. The head of the Freedom and Justice Party, the party associated with it, is an engineering professor. So they're not religious parties, they're not theocratic parties. They don't believe that those people who have religious knowledge should be the ones who are exercising political power. But when it comes to deciding on matters of public policy, they think that Islam has something to say. Islamic teachings, Islamic law has something to say. They emphasize an awful lot in recent years what they call the maqasid, the general goals of Islamic law. It's not important necessarily always to pay attention to the precise letter, but to take a look at the general spirit behind Islamic law and to use that to inform public policy. And in addition to being able to sort of present that, Jocelyne said, as sort of a voice of honesty and against corruption, it's also a presentation that is very, very hard for other political forces to push back against, because there's no such thing in most of these countries as an anti-religious or a secular party. In some countries, secularism is actually a bad word. It means not simply kind of distinguishing between religion and politics, but being an enemy of doing good things in the public life, which of course nobody could complain about. Even the National Democratic Party, which was a political party that governed Egypt for so long under both Sadat and Mubarak, and we think of sometimes as representing a secular political force, identified itself as Islamic, and as you look at National Democratic Party propaganda, they use religious symbols very, very heavily. So nobody is really going in any position to push back against that kind of conception.
I would like to add one
Please.
thing here, because it was said by the first speaker, Shadi Hamdi. Look at Tunisia. It looks probably they will function as a democracy. Does it mean that they will function as a secular country like we have in mind when we live in the US or in other places in the West? Probably not. In the sense that the discussion is going on now in Tunisia, they're not going to separate Islam and the state. They're not going to do that. And it's, I would say, a missed opportunity, because they do not have a strong minority, religious minority, that would come forward and say, so what happened with us? They have very vague discourse, and it's okay, because, the non-Muslim in Tunisia are less than 1%, so they are not a sufficient power to be able to put on the table a discussion on what happened to the other minorities. The point would not be to separate Islam and politics, or Islam and the state, because nobody is ready for that. And that's why the term secular is seen as an opposite to, religion, or an enemy, or hostile to religion. But it would be to provide for all religious groups the same kind of resources that Islam is getting, and to make sure that if you belong to a religious minority, you get the same kind of rights than a Muslim. And I see this discussion emerging for the Copts in Egypt. The Muslim Brothers have been speaking about that. But in Tunisia, I heard Ranouchi saying this kind of, big assertion that we're not going to be intolerant. But again, it's not going to happen because there is no minority in Tunisia. Egypt is a more interesting case, but I'm a little more worried, because on the right of the Muslim Brothers, the Salafi are pretty much, hostile to this opening or inclusiveness of the state institution to non-Muslims.
Since we we got you intrigued on the radio program from that first clip, we're going to play one more. And sorry, we're jumping around a little bit. There are a lot of topics, obviously, to cover. This is from a different segment. It actually was, I can't remember if it was part of the history segment that we did, but it's a clip from, I think, Afsin Molavi at the New America Foundation. And he's referencing Iran here, so I just want to run this brief clip. Yeah, you need a second just to find it? We'll just give Endel one sec. And we did also do a history segment in the program, about 12, 13 minutes, looking at the history of Islamist movements and parties going back, 80 or 90 years. Found some interesting archival audio, actually, in our research for that.
Sorry, it's not here. Oh, here we go. Am I ready?
Yep.
It's what Afshin Molavi at the New America Foundation calls post-Islamism, a sensibility he says has also evolved in his native Iran.
Iranians, unlike Egyptians, unlike Syrians, unlike Jordanians, do not have romantic, foggy notions about what Islamic government might be like. They've lived through it, they've seen it, it doesn't deliver the goods, the price of bread and tomatoes and meat is higher, there is no greater political repression, and guess what? Clerics can be just as corrupt as secular autocrats.
Well, I'll go a few things we could ask about from that clip, but I don't think that either of you focus on Iran per se in your work. But let's just want to ask you: do you agree? Do you think that Egyptians, Jordanians, etc., have foggy, romantic notions of Islamist parties and what they can deliver? That's sort of my first question. My second question would be, and you can take this either one, is Iran's revolution, which also came out of or became more extreme after what appeared to be a liberal initial phase and so on, is that a helpful analogy for helping us understand what's going on in the region. So you get a choice of those two. Do you want to start, Nathan?
Thanks. Well, yeah, let me focus primarily on the second. I mean, the Iranian case is actually a negative model, and opponents of Islamist parties will use it in the region as a way of tarring the Islamist movements. And they come back right away and say, no, we're very different from Iran, primarily in the theocratic dimension that I mentioned earlier. In Iran, people who have religious knowledge and religious training are at the top of the political hierarchy. And these movements say, no, we don't want that. We do want to free up religious scholars to do their work without state interference and to be able to speak the truth based on their own understanding of scholarship, but we're not trying to create a system in which religious authorities directly exercise political power. In terms of the fogginess of the notion, I mean, I think there sort of is something to that, and Jocelyne was sort of getting at it. When Egyptians voted, for instance, as a quarter of them did, for Salafi movements, I mean, I don't think they were voting for the Salafi program. I don't think the Salafis know what their program is. The Brotherhood, by contrast, has a long political experience. For the Salafis, their political experience goes back about 12 months or so. These are people who are extremely textually oriented, and they spent most of their time studying, and then all of a sudden they're in parliament. They're not quite sure what to do with it. So why vote for people who are kind of narrow textualists who don't have much of a political program, and to the extent that they have one, seem to have plagiarized it from other sources? The reason is quite simple. These are good, honest people, and Egyptians have they've been led for a long time by corrupt, dishonest people. So why not give the honest people a chance? Where that will play out, what their fate will be, I don't know. I mean, I mentioned before that I think the transition to a democratic system will be difficult for the Brotherhood. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for the Salafis because they're just not used to thinking in those terms. And an awful lot of the questions, when does majority rule govern, and when does your understanding of Islamic law govern, are questions they really haven't even begun to think about.
Yes, just two words on that. The Islamist, which again, the matrix is the Muslim Brothers. If you look at the way that Islamist parties are created everywhere, it's an emulation or very similar to the Muslim Brothers matrix, I would say. These are the only professional in politics right now in most of the countries, for reasons that are too long to explain here, but again, they have been operating under different duress and authoritarian regimes. They have created institutions, they are very well organized, to the point that everywhere when elections were on the verge of being, organized, the other professional parties were nervous because they were saying, they are organized, we are not. So we are not talking here about a body of clerics, getting into politics, which is the case indeed of Iran. But Iran is specific. It cannot, and so we are not talking about people who are clerics or muftis and getting into politics. Indeed, the Salafi in Egypt are more of this kind, but the majority are professional politics, secular. Most of them have a degree in mathematics, in physics, in engineering. They are not Al-Azhar, authorities. So, and they know exactly what kind of project they want. The issue is how much they're going to be able to compromise with the existing system. And that's why the Egyptian case is a case in point here. Because the more they compromise, the more they're going to lose this credibility they have with the majority of the population. And it was very interesting when the Egyptian Muslim Brothers gathered to create the party. There was a resistance within the group saying we don't want automatically to put all our efforts on a political party because we're going to lose our specific, I would say, popularity and influence in the society. And I think it's a good point. So we have to see them as more a social movement, organized movement, present everywhere. And if they remain like that, they never have political failure. You may remember one of my French colleagues a few years ago wrote a book called The Failure of Political Islam. He was right in the sense, if you look at this very narrow professional politics that, that go and win or lose elections. But Islamism has become part of civil societies everywhere in Muslim majority countries. And if they remain as such, they're never going to lose because they are there. And people don't even articulate anymore, you know, this kind of value of vision. And that's what happened in Tahrir Square. The young people, the technique savvy people, they are the brother, sister, children of 20 years of socialization where civil society has been shaped by the Islamists. And I mean, so so they don't claim Islam anymore. You know, it's embedded, ingrained. It doesn't mean that they are automatically intolerant or that they want the ulema to govern. And I think that's what we have the hardest time to understand. But we have to be vigilant on the question of civil rights and religious minority. In my opinion, the litmus test for the Islamists is, do we accept the freedom of expression for all religious minority, or we don't? And this is the only question that matters. They can put Sharia in the constitution, so what? It's already there. You know, in the case of Egypt, it's already there. So we don't have to be anxious about the Sharia term. It's there. It's how they're going to operate and make this civil space more inclusive for people who are not Muslim, who do not want to be Muslim anymore, which is another issue.
And I guess then I have 10 other questions, but I'll just ask one more and then we can open it up. Then this is the Washington question then. So what should the administration, what should guide U.S. policy in its engagement with Islamist parties in the region? And I guess I heard an answer from you, Jocelyne, which is that that's a key litmus test in terms of our engagement and support, which is their willingness to support freedom of expression for religious minorities. I'm wondering, Nathan, if you have any Washington advice for that now when the administration engages with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and so on.
Yeah, I think for a long time we've kind of asked the question the wrong way, kind of, you know, should we engage with the Muslim Brotherhood? And to me that's sort of an odd question, as if somehow if we ignore them they would go away. Politics doesn't work that way. They've got a very strong domestic constituency. They are part of the political fabric of life in Egypt, and if we're going to deal with Egypt, we're going to have to deal with the brothers. We don't have to deal exclusively with the brothers, but we will have to deal with them. So the question is not do we engage, but sort of how is it that we approach them? And I would say essentially right now Egypt is at a very inward-looking moment. Egyptians, by and large, are primarily concerned with what goes on in their own countries. I always say that they're like Americans that way. The rest of the world it seems less interesting and relevant. But that's particularly the case right now when very fundamental issues are being decided. That means that outsiders, I think, are going to have to realize their levers are limited and to focus on just a very few things. How it is that, I mean, what the United States has been focusing on so far is interesting. I've asked leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, when Americans show up, what is it they ask you about? And the agenda is essentially four things: Christians, women, Israel, and the economy.
In that order?
I didn't ask about the order. But in a sense, I think that sort of makes some sense. You press sort of on essentially existing international obligations and about the sort of core rights for Egyptian citizens. A very broad agenda to sort of trying to shape the Muslim Brotherhood or pick this faction versus that faction or that sort of thing, or we will deal with this political party but not that political party, I think is probably where we would be flattering ourselves with the extent to which we could shape the Egyptian political system.
Well, let's open it up and take any questions that anyone may have. Jocelyne is only here till 1:30 and has to catch a flight. That's why, for those who came late, to apologize, we had to start early. And we may also finish a little bit early.
I've been trying to figure out what the concern is here. We're very proud of our Christian Judaic inclinations in this country, our constitution and what have you, were based on that. Why are we fearful of the Islamists basing their background on their religion? The only suggestion that I heard was that it has to do with freedom of religion. Are there other concerns other than our concern about their attitude towards other religious groups? Or what is the concern here?
Well, I heard you mention women, attitudes towards women as one, but...
It's a very good question. Actually, you are right. When you look at Islamists and what they do in politics, they do pretty much what any regular party would do. But again, because it's not that they have created an intolerant system. And that's why I insisted a lot on a rule of law that has been established since the nation building of the state, that has been unfair to the people who are not Muslims in the country. And the question then becomes, how much of this rule of law would they be able to establish to include, and again, Egypt is a case in point here more than Tunisia, to include the Copts in the new nation, the new national Egypt, you know, or to include people who could say, I don't believe in God anymore. And this has been put off the chart of all the institution and the political culture that has been built. So it's not to refer to Islam, it's how much of this reference can also coexist with some kind of toleration. And I distinguish here between tolerance, which is, you know, the one-on-one personal interaction we can have, and toleration, which is a principle inscribed in law, meaning if I am discriminated on my religion, and it can happen, not everybody is perfect and may not like me, but I can refer to law to find a compensation or a justice. We have to understand that in these countries, and it's not because of Islamists, there is no such regulation for someone belonging to minorities. And why I'm insisting on that? Because when I was in Europe, I worked with the European Union to engage the discussion with Turkey on how they're going to enter the European Union. Turkey is a secular country according to our Western vision. But if you look at, if you are an Alevi in Turkey, if you are not a Sunni Hanafi, you have on your ID to put Sunni. You are persecuted. You don't have the same right. The Sunni Muslims have all the institutions paid by the state. If I am an Alevi, I have to find my own sources. So this, in my opinion, this is not secular. And this is Kemal Atatürk. This is not the Islamist in charge now. So the whole discussion of the EU was to tell them, so what do you do with your minorities? We cannot make you enter the club if you do not extend the rule of law to everybody. You have the right to have your rule of law. If you want to fund religions, go for it. But fund all of them and protect all of them. You see what I'm after? So it's not about Islamists versus seculars. That's why I think Turkey is a very interesting case. Because Turkey may look secular in the Western culture of the sense. In the sense of the law, Turkey is not secular.
I like the way you frame the question because, in a sense, there's something about, when we're talking about Islamist parties, that does sound a little bit familiar to an American, right? Our politicians talk to us about God all the time. And if I thought about how the Muslim Brotherhood would remold Egypt if it had absolutely no opposition, it would look a little bit like, I think, the America my father was born into, which banned alcohol, which banned commerce on Sundays and so on. I prefer the America I live in now, but it's not something completely alien, okay? It's something that again, to an American looks a little bit familiar, even if it would be annoying. To me, if you're asking what is it to be really concerned about, I would answer the question two ways. One is, if I were an Egyptian, what I would be concerned about is not necessarily the Brotherhood's agenda, but the weakness of all the other parties. And is the Brotherhood going to be, not because of anything internal to it, but because of the basically an incomplete political scene, going to turn into something that looks like the PRI in Mexico, which wins election after election and kind of develops into this dominant and perhaps corrupt political machine. So that would be one worry, and getting ideological concessions from the Brotherhood isn't going to change that. The only thing that's going to change that is a formation of other viable political movements, and I don't see that happening now. From an American perspective, the second, what is it that we're about? The fact is, in both these countries, both Egypt and Tunisia, American diplomats were not unaware of the flaws in these political systems and in the ways in which the rulers basically failed to meet the needs of their citizens. But these were fundamentally regimes that regarded themselves and that could work very effectively as partners. It's clear that in Islamist-dominated political systems, these places are going to be a pain to work with. They're going to be a headache because they're going to be much more responsive to public opinion. Their conception of the proper regional order is probably more distant from the American ones. So I wouldn't say that these are a mortal threat to American security interests, far from it. But it will make diplomacy just a little bit more difficult. And so again, it's not so much a threat as a headache for American diplomats.
Hi, Ms. Cesari. You mentioned that Sharia is in the Egyptian law right now, that there is no discussion about it. However, it's not in the Tunisian law. The Tunisian Civil Code is the Napoleon Code. The only thing that's from Sharia is the heritage. So we saw a lot of people coming out of the streets in Tunis asking for Sharia to be the constitution, asking for the new government to call for Sharia as a source of law. How do you think this will affect the Tunisian political scene as well as the civil scene, since it's been very secular, even with the despotic regime, and people have been separating politics and religion for a while? How do you think this could affect the future Tunisia and the North Africa as a whole? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You're right. Sharia is not in the Tunisian constitution. Islam as religion of the state is. Okay, and it has been interesting to follow the position of Ghannouchi on this issue. For example, I don't know, I have no crystal ball, but he has been very reassuring that he will not touch the civil code. That is indeed one of the, we always marvel about the Turkish one, but the Tunisian one is the most egalitarian for women and has been ahead of its time for a long period of time now. He said, we're not going to touch that. And actually, the women who are following the Islamists, they've been socialized in this system. They do not want, a withdrawal of all their rights right now. So I think that I would not be worried too much about changing the civil law right now in Tunisia. What Ghannouchi is saying, he is not talking about Sharia as a set of established law. He's talking about principles, like you would in the American or Western context talk about the 10 Commandments, and so that's what he's saying, and he's having a very, articulated discourse about that. But you're right, there is now, like it came up in Egypt, it's more marginal in Tunisia, but there is a Salafi emergence. And they are pushing for a more conservative, anti-women, and again, because there is not so much minorities in Tunisia, the focus is on women. But unlike, I would say, the Egyptian case, what is also interesting that you have a strong secular voice that allowed a lot of people to express themselves with no connection to Islam. And as long as the secularists, I would say, and the Islamists talk to each other, it would be healthy in the sense that compromise can happen. While I don't see this exchange happening in Egypt. In other words, yes, there is Salafi. There are Salafi coming up. I would not be worried too much as long as the connection is between secularists and Islamists and not Salafi. And it seems that Ennahda doesn't want to have anything to do with the Salafi for now. You see, I would be worried if it moved this way on the right. Yeah.
Any other question?
I was just wondering, how do you think the rise of Islamist parties, specifically in Egypt, would affect the relationship between, or the political relationship between Egypt and Israel?
Badly, not necessarily disastrously. to me, this is actually one of the most interesting things about the evolution of the Brotherhood's position. The Brotherhood does not like Israel, does not really approve of the peace treaty with Israel, and has a very close personal and ideological relationship with Hamas. And so, understandably, the Egyptian Revolution, the rise of the Brotherhood, has set off real concern in Israel, and certainly concern in American foreign policy circles that actually, after all, sponsored the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. That said, I think the way that the Brotherhood is acting right now, the phrase that I would use is one I'm actually going to borrow from somebody else I just heard use it, Mahazam of Chatham House, is they're a government in waiting. That's how they regard themselves. And when you talk to Brotherhood leaders, to me, kind of what comes across just in tone, in content, even in body languages, these are people who feel an enormous sense of responsibility. They're no longer an opposition movement. They're about to take over. So so they've kind of got this ideology, which makes them, in a sense, very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but they're trying to assume leadership positions in a state that has existing treaty relationships, that has a very close security relationship with the United States, it has an important aid relationship with the United States, and it has no real alternative to offer. I mean, nobody in Egypt wants war with Israel, so what does kind of canceling it mean? What would canceling this peace treaty mean? I think the Brotherhood as a whole will not reach out to Israel, and if Israelis showed up and asked for appointments, they wouldn't get them. But an Egyptian government in which the Brotherhood has a presence, I think, is one that will essentially maintain existing relationships with Israel. The way that the Brotherhood kind of squares this with its ideological commitments is to say, essentially, we honor Egypt's international obligations. Any party to an international treaty has the right to request renegotiation of it. And there are certain things in the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that we don't like. For instance, we don't like force limitations in Sinai. Those are kind of a derogation of Egyptian sovereignty. If you press them on this and say, okay, so of course every country has a right to ask for renegotiation, but the other side has to agree to have it renegotiated. And essentially the response you get is, no, we would use the mechanisms of the treaty or of international law in order to address any kind of concerns that we have. So it's, in a sense, a movement that right now is sort of trying to make the transition from being a movement that had no responsibility and could say what it wanted and could be responsive to a constituency which to the extent that it paid attention to the issue was sharply anti-Israel, sort of change from that orientation to one that says essentially we're going to be taking over an Egyptian state that's enmeshed in all kinds of relationships that we can kind of steer, but we can't completely dictate. What is surprising to me is not that they're making this transition, but they're making it very, very quickly in the space of a year. Essentially, what they figured out is what they had to say in terms of the formula that I just gave you that could square with their past positions and still make the Americans happy. And they've done it. The Americans seem very happy, I mean, that they pushed the Brotherhood that far.
Vis-a-vis Hamas, though, and their relationship with Hamas, what has been going on there, and are the Americans happy?
That's a complex and fascinating relationship because first, how does Hamas look to the Brotherhood? My favorite example here is in 2006 elections, Hamas presented itself to Palestinian voters as the arm of the Egyptian Mother Movement. And think about that for a second. How many times does a party run for election saying that we're the arm of a foreign movement and win? Which is what Hamas did. So Hamas has very close and draws some of its kind of legitimacy from the fact that it has a very close relationship with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. That gives them very, very strong pull on the Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood does look at them as sort of, their kid brother or their daughter movement. Absolutely. But at least for the short to medium term, that actually, I think, has a quieting effect, because essentially what Hamas is in the position of doing is being told implicitly by the Brotherhood. Look, this is a historic opportunity for us. We have been an opposition movement since we were founded. We now have the possibility of going into government. If there is a major regional conflagration, this could get messed up. So can't you hold it quiet for a while? And Hamas is essentially, I think a lot of what is going on with Hamas right now is an attempt to try and figure out how much or how it can kind of assist this regional Islamist wave, and it's not by rocking the boat.
Jocelyne, if you had any final comments, I know you have to go to the airport.
Yeah, I have to leave, so I apologize for cutting off the discussion right now. But again, my only word to wrap this up is to look at in which already existing political framework these parties evolve, and to see how much of it, there is a discourse level, but there is also this pragmatic dimension that either they are able to change some elements, but they're not going to rock the boat and start from scratch. I think this is important to give them the credit that they are professional politics. We may not like their politics, but they are not, lunatic clerics. As we tend to project on this kind of actors sort of irrational behavior because they believe they are not ready to or able to negotiate, which again, if you look at the evolution of the Muslim Brothers, is quite the opposite. But it doesn't mean that there are no wild cards. The Salafi are a wild card, and we don't know how they can evolve. But again, it's to take them for what they are, professional of politics. And in a way, they do politics not in the secular way we have been raised in, but it doesn't make them completely, I would say, unreliable. Sorry, I have to leave.
Thank you. And we just and we have time to take a couple more questions if anyone has for Professor Brown, and then. If there aren't any, I'll ask one or two more, and then we can wrap up. And it's actually unfortunate Jocelyne has to leave because I think she was talking about Olivier Waugh, that book from a few years ago. And I just want to make this one quote because it was in, again, Washington Knowledge. It was in a David Ignatius column. So I just wanted to mention it to you, unfortunately not to her, but he says, democratic, this is on, Ignatius wrote a column on the administration's, I think he called it a cosmic gamble or something in terms of engaging with the Muslim Brotherhood and whether, things are going to work out all right and so on and so forth. And he quotes at the end from Waugh, who said, democratic culture does not precede democratic institutions. Democratic culture is the internalization of these institutions. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that point. I guess my particular question is, well, does Egypt, let's take Egypt for example, or Tunisia and so on, have the institutions, say democratic or liberal democratic institutions, into which a party like the Muslim Brotherhood can become internalized? I mean, when I think of the Turkish model, we didn't have an opportunity, but we do our organization does a lot of work there. There is a pre-existing structure, a system 80 years old and so on, that has worked to moderate through shaving off the extremes a long history of Islamist parties, which led to the current one, which is among the most moderate, quote unquote. So, what are your thoughts on that, this idea? Oh, yeah.
One mic here, yeah. I'm sort of sympathetic with the idea that essentially democracy builds Democrats often rather than the other way around. So yeah, so the question is there a proto-democracy there to help build Democrats in these two countries? One thing that they do share is fairly strong states and fairly strong state institutions. They're much better off than, for instance, in Libya or Yemen that way in the various states in the Arab world that are undergoing transitions, because you've got some strong existing state institutions. The second thing that you've got, I think, is a recent experience with, in both countries, with a feeling that authority was was much too concentrated in the hands of a small number of individuals and a small number of institutions chiefly controlled by the presidency. So there's a reaction against that. You make arguments for democratizing existing structures, and they have strong resonance in both Tunisia and Egypt. The missing element is the one that I suggested earlier. It's a pluralism of political players. In Turkey, in essence, you had that kind of system arise, a more democratic system arise, but you had non-democratic actors, the courts and the military, who were playing this strong role, and they did it sometimes in a brutal and undemocratic way. To me, that's not the ideal way to do it. And even in Turkey, as a result, right now, I think you've got the possibility of a single dominant party emerging because the other political parties are weak. I think that problem could easily recur in both Egypt and Tunisia. I'm more optimistic about Tunisia simply because there's a strong labor movement. There's other political parties that performed credibly in elections. In Egypt, that simply hasn't emerged. And I'd go back to the comment that actually Jocelyne mentioned. Non-Islamist political actors kept on complaining about the Egyptian transition process. These elections are coming too quick. We're not organized. We're not prepared. And I think that's absolutely right. What they missed is that another 6 months wouldn't have done a bit of difference. That what they lack is a sustained organizational presence throughout Egyptian society, building it up through constituencies throughout the country, in smaller towns, villages, poor neighborhoods of Cairo, and so on. The only organizations out there that sort of organize people are Islamist ones. So that, to me, is a real worrying sign. It's not, again, that they're not Democrats. It's that there's no real basis yet for pluralism in political life that will present Egyptian voters with meaningful choices in the future.
I'll just end with a last question that's a crazy question politically, but maybe more interesting from a scholarly perspective or theologically, which is whether Israel is actually a model, or maybe a poor model, but one that Muslim Brotherhood and other countries, Islamist parties, should be looking to. And you're already furrowing your brow, so I'll take one shot at it, which is, and Jocelyne was talking about the distinction in the Western mind between, religion as a set of ideas and beliefs versus practices, which I think is a Christian notion more than a Jewish notion. And I'm wondering, therefore, whether the Jewish state, which struggles with the whole, it also has a religious system that melds belief and practice together and doesn't see necessarily a separation of religion from politics theologically, might therefore actually be, through its strengths and weaknesses, failings and so on, one to look at as an example. So I'm throwing that out.
Okay. I think it's actually a fascinating analogy, and I was reminded of it this past week when the Egyptian parliament had a moment of silence after the death of Pope Shenouda. And some Salafi deputies left the chamber, said Islam doesn't know a moment of silence. This is an imported, non-Islamic practice. And the reason I was reminded of the Israeli case is that you have ultra-Orthodox political parties in Israel who say the same thing about national moments of silence in memory of Israeli war dead. They said, it's fine, commemorate the war dead, but there are Jewish ways to do this, and you're using this Goyish way to do it. It's essentially the same kind of argument. I wouldn't push the analogy too far. Obviously, secular political ideas are much stronger in the Israeli context. But in one way, on a sort of a vague philosophical level, here's one way where I would say, yes, Israel is a Jewish state, but nobody knows what that means. Or I should say, everybody knows what that means, but they all disagree with each other about what that means. Israel has no official religion. Okay, there is nothing that says, there's no constitution in the first place, but there's nothing that says Judaism is a religion. What do they mean when they say it's a Jewish state? Is it a state of the Jewish people? Is it a state that somehow gives Judaism as a religion some kind of special status? Is it something in which Jewish symbols become national symbols and so on? What is being Jewish anyway? Is it religious? Is it ethnic? Is it national? These are categories which in a sense you're forcing on a a tradition that doesn't really necessarily think in terms of them. And I think something of the same sort is kind of happening in the, at least in the Arab world. Yes, they know that they want, most people know that they want something, some kind of Islamic, as Shadi Hamid said, some sort of role for Islam in public life. But kind of what is Islam and in what way and that sort of thing, people will be tying themselves up in knots or trying to tie each other in knots, I think is probably the better analogy, about exactly how to implement them. So simply saying Israel is a Jewish state actually raises more questions than it answers, and I think we're going to see the same thing in the Arab world. We're saying we want to have an Islamic system, or we want to have a greater role for Islam, is going to raise many more questions than it answers.
Well, that's a good way to end this kind of a conversation with two, I think, really good distinguished scholars working on this subject. So we've raised more questions than we've answered, and we try to answer some in the show in a brief manner. And so we recommend anyone wants to hear it, you can go on check on the website, and we've got the transcripts as well. And actually, it's all outside. Also, if you want hard copies, I forgot. So thank you, Professor Brown. We appreciate your time, and thanks everybody for coming.